All right, guys, welcome back. In this module, we're going to talk all about APIs, or rather application programming interfaces. Now, it's very likely that you would have come across this term already. People talk about APIs for this and APIs for that, but what exactly is an API anyways? Well, here's a good definition. So, an application programming interface is a set of commands, functions, protocols, and objects that programs can use to create software or interact with an external system. Now, it provides developers with standard commands for performing common operations, so they don't have to write the code from scratch. Now, this is a very, very broad definition, and there's also a lot of components to it. So in this lesson, I'm going to break this down and try to explain all of the different parts of an API and how it works in practice. So if we take that first part, which is a set of commands, functions, protocols, and objects that programmers can use to create software, well, if you think about that, we've actually already used an API, right? jQuery basically had a whole bunch of functions and methods that allowed us to create software. And it made it so much quicker to perform a whole bunch of things using JavaScript and the DOM by using these special methods. So this is a form of API that developers use to create software. So for example, for those of you guys who are on the iOS or Android development tracks, then you'll know that to develop an iOS or an Android app, we're using the APIs that Apple has provided or that Google has provided in order to interact with the iOS or the Android operating systems. And this is essentially code that somebody else has written for you to interact with the hardware. And you can use it by looking through the documentation and calling some of these methods. Now, that's a very common form of API. And in fact, whenever we're creating a website or an app or any sort of software, we're essentially using these types of APIs. But in this module, the type of APIs that I want to focus on and what people tend to mean when they talk about APIs are APIs that are used to interact with an external system. So, for example, if you take a look at the Tinder app, and if you scroll down on somebody's profile, you'll see that there's a section for shared friends and shared interests. Now, where does this information come from? Well, it doesn't come from Tinder. In fact, it comes from Facebook. So when you sign up to Tinder, which is this dating app, essentially, if you're not familiar with it, then it asks you to log in via Facebook. So now Tinder has your Facebook login details, and it's able to go to Facebook servers and interact with Facebook in order to bring all of this information back into the Tinder app. So it will look at who are your friends, and it will look at what are the things that you've liked in the past, and it will use that information to populate these sections in the Tinder app. Now, up till now, our websites have only really been able to make requests to our server, and these are GET requests. And in return, our server sends back a response, and that includes all of the HTML, CSS, JavaScript files that's required in order to render our website. Now, what if for our website, we wanted information from Facebook's servers? Well, in that case, what we actually need to do is we need to make a request to somebody else's server, so say Facebook server, from our server. Now, this could be a GET request, for example. Say we have a website, which is a dating website that matches people up by the things that they've liked on Facebook. Then we need the data from Facebook in order to do this. So we could make a GET request from our server to somebody else's server. Well, in this case, it's Facebook server. And Facebook will send a response back with all of that data that we need in order to populate our website. And this is one of the most common ways of using APIs, which is to interact with an external source. Now, when we're doing this, we can't just willy-nilly go into somebody else's server and make a request. No, we have to do it through the API, the application programming interface. And this interface will determine what are the things that we can request from their server and how should we do it. So it's kind of almost a bit like a menu, if you will, right? For example, if we were trying to tap into the API of a website that has data on cryptocurrencies, then that API menu might include things like, well, you could get the price of Bitcoin, you could get the price of Ethereum, you could get the price of other cryptocurrencies. And we can choose, based off this menu or this API documentation, what it is that we can do to interact with this other person's server. So let's take a look at this in practice. Now over here, I've got the website, which is one of the largest, or as they say, one of the oldest sources of Bitcoin data. And we can go over to their APIs by going to this drop-down list and going to the documentation. Now, the documentation describes how you can interact with this particular API or this particular website. So, for example, say if we wanted price data for, say, Bitcoins, right? Well, they tell you this is how you can get price data for a specified symbol, which is basically a cryptocurrency. And this is how you structure the HTTP request. This is the base URL that you have to go to, and then you specify a pair of symbols. So for example, how much does one Bitcoin cost in US dollars? And on the right, they've actually created an example request for you, so you can test out this API. And you can see that the first keyword that they're using is something called curl. Now, curl is a way of making an HTTP request through the command line. And if you have a look on this website, I've included a link to it in the lesson resources. You can see that curl is simply a client for URLs, or it's simply a way for you to interact with a URL on the command line. And it's almost easier if you pronounce it as CURL to understand exactly what it does. So let's give it a go. So if you open up Hyper and you type curl, remember that every time you type a new command, you can first write man in front of it, so man curl, and this, when you hit enter, will give you the manual for this particular command. So it has a description and it has a whole bunch of things that you can do. It's basically a copy of this website. But it's useful when you're dealing with a new command line command that you've never seen before. Just typing man in front of it can give you a big hint as to what you can do. Now, to quit this, simply type Q and you exit that command, and we can clear our terminal. So now, if I wanted to see the URL of Google, then I can type CURL https www.google.com. Now this basically makes a simple GET request to the servers of google.com, and it will send back the response, which is all of this. Now, if you actually take a look at this closely, you can see it's simply the HTML that your browser would render, for example, if you tried to go to google.com. Now, I'm pasting it here in Atom because I can save it as a local file, say google.html. Now Atom will recognize it as HTML code, and I can use Control-Option-B to beautify this HTML code, or if you can't find it, just head over to Packages, Atom, Beautify. So now it's looking like something that we're familiar with, right? It's got CSS in there, it's got HTML code in there, and there's a few errors here and there. But if we save this, and we try to open up this HTML inside Chrome, then you can see that this is basically just the Google page, right? And it's the same when I go through the browser, although the browser is obviously a lot better at getting back images and assets. But this is essentially what we get back from our curl. So now let's try and use that curl command to get back some data from this Bitcoin average API. And if we copy and paste this into our terminal, maybe it's worth clearing our terminal first to get rid of all of that junk and paste in this example request that they've supplied for us. This basically gets the ticker data for BTC to USD conversion at the current moment. So when I hit enter, I get some data back. And this data is structured in a format called JSON. Now, we've spoken about this briefly before, but in the coming lessons, we're going to be diving deep into this particular format, and we're going to see how we can use it to grab pieces of data from our API requests. But it's pretty simple if you just take a look at it. It's a whole bunch of key value pairs. So for example, in this case, we've got the key of ask, and it has an associated value of 8,259. And this, if you dig through the Bitcoin average documentation, will tell you that this is the current asking price of Bitcoin in US dollars. So one Bitcoin is worth roughly around $8,200 right now. So that was pretty cool, pretty interesting. And if we wanted to tap into one of the other routes that they have, then we can simply, as they say, change the currency pair, right? So what if instead of BTC to USD, we did Ethereum, so ETH, to euros, EUR? Now we get back a result, and it tells us that currently to buy a single Ether, we have to pay around 580 euros. So a lot cheaper than Bitcoin, but still pretty pricey. So that was just a really quick way of showing you how we can make requests through an API to grab data from this website, bitcoinaverage.com. Now, what we've seen so far is that there are predetermined routes. So this particular route has been predefined, this /ETHEUR. Now, if we try to tap into a route that doesn't exist, let's say, I don't know, ETH to ETH, then we actually get an error. It says that symbol is not supported. So this means that this route doesn't actually exist. The servers of Bitcoin Average haven't planned for you to be able to use this particular combination of currencies. And sometimes when you're using these APIs to get data from another website's servers, you might need to provide pieces of input. So for example, what if we wanted the price of Bitcoin at a particular date? Now, this is the equivalent of going to a restaurant and you're ordering something like eggs, right, for your breakfast. But you might want to provide a parameter, say how you want your eggs done. Do you want it scrambled? Do you want it sunny side up? Do you want it hard boiled? And in order to do this through these APIs, we have to use parameters. Now, when you look at the API docs, you'll notice that some of these requests allow you to provide a parameter or an input. Now, if we take a look at historical data, because I'm interested in how much I needed to pay for Bitcoin maybe a few years ago. For those of you guys who are doing the iOS track, you will know that there is a challenge in there called the Bitcoin ticker. And this gets you to build a Bitcoin app using exactly this API, Bitcoin Average. Now, we created that particular tutorial sometime in 2015. And I'm interested in what would have happened if I bought a whole bunch of Bitcoins when I created that tutorial. So let's take a look at the historical data that we can get from this API. So if I click on historical data, you can see that there is something called price at timestamp. So this returns a price at a specified timestamp in the Unix format. So the Unix timestamp is basically the number of seconds since January the 1st, 1970, and this is known as the Unix epoch. So this is the timestamp that a lot of websites and APIs will work with. So let's enter a date over here to convert our normal date into a timestamp. So I'm going to put in 2015, August the 1st. And I'm going to convert to a timestamp. And it tells me that that particular date is this many seconds since January the 1st, 1970. So that's the timestamp that we're going to be using. And if we take a look back at the API for getting the price at a particular timestamp, you can see that this is the basic URL that we need to use. And they have a whole bunch of routes for, say, BTC to USD and all of the other currency pairs. But then there's this little question mark. Now, browsing the web, you might have occasionally come across places where you see that question mark in the URL up here. Now, that question mark basically shows you that everything that comes afterwards is a parameter or an input. So in this case, the parameter name is called @. And inside there, we can specify the timestamp in Unix format in order to get the historical price of Bitcoins. So let's try this. Let's copy this code. And let's clear our terminal and paste it in here, but we're going to change the value of that parameter. So as we said, the question mark denotes the beginning of your parameters. And in a lot of APIs, you can add on a whole bunch of parameters, say at which location, at which latitude, longitude, and we're going to come to see that later on in this module. But currently we only have one input or one parameter. It's called @, and afterwards we have to provide the Unix timestamp, which we've converted to be this many seconds. So let's paste that in here. And if I hit enter now, I get the price of Bitcoins in US dollars at the historical time of August the 1st, 2015. So you can see back then, Bitcoins were only worth $283. And now they're worth something like $8,000. So I think I would have made a pretty penny if I decided to buy a whole bunch of Bitcoins when we created the first Bitcoin tutorial. But it's never too late, as they say. This is definitely not investment advice. Do not listen to what I say, because clearly I'm not a very good investor if I missed out on this opportunity. But I do know a thing or two about APIs. So in this case, our server is making that request to Bitcoin Average's server. And in that request, we've packaged some parameters, namely what is the timestamp that we're interested in for the price of Bitcoin. Now, when Bitcoin Average's server receives that request, along with the parameter input, it'll be able to look through its database and send back a response with a whole bunch of data that corresponds to that particular date in time. So that's how we're able to provide specific pieces of information along with our request to the API. So as you can imagine, if Bitcoin Average's servers had to specify a route for every single one of these requests, then they would have to have a route for, say, 2018, May the 1st, then another route for 2018, May the 2nd, and that's just not feasible. So instead, they have a parameter that allows you to specify a timestamp, and that gets used in order to search through their database to provide you the piece of data that you want. Now, for the keen-eyed amongst you, you might have noticed that this request looks a little bit more complicated than the last one that we made. What is all of these things? Well, let's see what happens when we remove it. So let's just take this URL, and we're going to not include this -h and testing, and we're simply going to write curl and this request passing in a parameter to get the historical Bitcoin price at that timestamp. So if I hit enter now, you'll see that I get an error, and it says that unauthenticated requests can't access this particular endpoint. So it's saying that you need to be authenticated with the API provider in order to try and get the historical data. Now, why is this? Now, if we imagine the server of these external websites as a bank, right? So they have a vault that contains precious data. And if they had this kind of open access policy where anyone can go in there and open up the vault and take out, say, £100, and all they had to do was write down on a logbook that said on the 25th of November, Angela Yu took out £100 from the vault, and that's equivalent to how we performed our first API request when we got the current price of Bitcoin in US dollars. This is a very trusting policy because, as you might imagine, I could easily go in there and take out £1,000, but say that I only took out 100, right? And if I'm building my application or my website on this API provider, and I'm taking out so much information from their data servers and using up so much resources of their servers, and this is completely unchecked and unguarded, then you can see that this is very much open for abuse, right? So what's the solution? Well, you might need an interface. So something in between you, the requester, and the resource to act as an interface that can deal with your requests. And this is basically an analogy for our API. Now, in this bank, we don't just have an open vault that anybody can come in and take money and just write down what they did. Instead, we have a bank teller, and she can help and act as the interface between us and the vault. So, for example, I can say, I'd like to withdraw £100, please. And she will ask me for, what is your password, right? What is your authentication? And I will give back a password that allows me to take out money. And in the API world, this is equivalent to an API key. And if we take a look under the authentication tab, it says that the majority of our APIs are free to use. So that situation with the open plan bank where you just go in and you take data out of their vault. But certain endpoints require authentication that requires registration and the generation of an API key. So this will identify who you are that's making these requests. And if you keep coming in and taking lots and lots of data, then they can start charging you for that privilege. So this is why they need an API key and authentication. Now, in our case, because we're just testing the API out, then we're adding this flag, which basically allows you to make a very small number of requests and just to test out how it works. But we're not yet authenticating ourselves. Now, in addition to making GET requests, namely getting data from these external website servers, we can also make POST requests where we give pieces of data to be stored in their database. So for example, in the bank scenario, it'd be the equivalent of saying that I'd like to deposit £100 into your bank's vault, please. And this also will go through the application programming interface so that you can process your request and add your data to their database. Now, the problem is that not all websites work the same, right? So for example, you can go to the bank and you can deposit some money. You can give them some data. But if you went to the police station, you can't say deposit some money, or you can't give them pieces of data. So different websites work differently. So we now have a fuller picture of what's happening. Effectively, your server is making a request via the API or the interface to somebody else's server, and you're passing in some parameters as inputs. And their server is interacting with their database in order to grab the relevant piece of data that you need based off your request and your parameters. Now, once it's gotten that data, then it will send it back through the response, and you will end up with that data that you wanted from their database. And if you had any data that you wanted to deposit into their database, you also have to go through the API and their server in order to do this. Now, sometimes if you're trying to do something that is completely off the books and is not possible, for example, if you went to the bank and you tried to get the bank teller to do your chemistry homework and you made a request that said, what is the 31st element of the periodic table? Then she'll say, I don't know. And that, in website terms, is a 404, right? So could not process your request, basically. So this is why we need to read the documentation every single time we use an API. And some websites have better documentation than others, but if they provide a public open API, they will all have documentation that tells you what you can do, how you should do it, what are the parameters, and an example or two of how you can use their API. Now, in later lessons, I'm going to be showing you a whole bunch of other APIs, but if you're interested in taking a look at what are the available APIs out there, then head over to any-api.com and you can see a giant list of a whole bunch of APIs that you can tap into. And by completing this module, you're going to have the power and responsibility of interacting with these APIs. Now, there's two tiers of APIs, if you will. There are APIs which are accessible to the public, and there are some which are only accessible internally. So, for example, the employee at the police station is able to do a lot more things at the police station with their data than you, a member of the public, can, right? And similarly, the employees at the bank are able to tap into APIs that you can't. And these are known as private APIs. And these private APIs are undocumented and not really available to the public, but sometimes they can still be accessed if you can guess the right endpoints, if you can guess the right parameters. Now, this is kind of equivalent to going to the bank when it's at night, when all the bank tellers have gone home, and you just try to come in and take some money from the vault. Now, in other situations, it might just be that it's a website that doesn't have a public API at all. So say, just a simple restaurant's websites. And coming in, interacting with their database through what you might have guessed, these private APIs, it's kind of like robbing somebody's house, right? Just going in there without permission, trying to take data from their database. Now, in real life, something similar happened between Instagram and a company called Follogram. Now, what Follogram did is that they somehow figured out through reverse engineering or some clever stuff that they could access some of Instagram's private APIs, so those that were only available to their internal staff to use when they're building the websites, and this allowed them to build features that people wanted but that were not yet available. So for example, they allowed you to have a button on your website, say your blog or your Tumblr, that allowed people to click on it to follow you on Instagram. And this was by tapping into Instagram's private APIs. Now, the result of this is Instagram basically shut them down and told them to stop using the APIs and changed those private APIs so that they couldn't guess them anymore, and Follogram no longer exists. Now, if you want to read a post by Kevin Systrom, who's the founder of Instagram, on why they did this and what this was all about, then take a look inside the resources of this lesson, and I've provided a link to it. But this is a common thing that you might come across: private versus public APIs. Now, I recommend to just stick to public APIs, which are well documented and easy to work with, and they won't change overnight. Because at the end of the day, an open public API is basically a contract between the providers and the developer. And it just says, here's how to interact with our system. These are the set of rules, guidelines, and things that you can do. And we promise to not change the endpoints and responses without notice, so you can build a good product that uses our data and our infrastructure. So that was a whirlwind tour of everything that I could possibly think about around APIs. And in the coming lessons, we're going to be seeing some of these things in action. And we're going to be building websites that use external websites, making GET and POST requests, changing and getting data from external sources, and modifying the database of external websites. So a lot of exciting stuff is yet to come in this module. So later on, as we revisit some of these topics and building the code around it, you might find that rewatching this lecture will boost your understanding of what's going on. So it's something that you might want to come back to in the future as well. But in the next lesson, we're going to get started using and building websites that rely on APIs. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.